Um, we'll have an initial overview of NLP as part of our survey of contemporary AI technology. I'll share here. Let me know if you guys have any questions. If you guys also want to have any consultations or anything like this for the project or for any graph related materials, just let me know, and we'll be able to hold the consultations. Usually evening na ako libre, but other than that, yeah, please feel free to schedule that. Sige, so natural language processing is one of the more interesting fields of AI personally. This is what I specialize in. This is what I'm doing my research on. And it will be very heavily and largely used with the upcoming political campaign. Everyone will try to understand what people are talking about, speaking, saying about specific political issues, candidates, and matters. And NLP is the technology that's going to be at the center of it all. So language, we have to define this first, is the method of human communication, either spoken or written, consisting of words that we typically use in a structured and conventional way. And this is what we learned as children. We took our English classes and there were these, how do I say this, rules, structures of language and grammar that we had to abide by. You don't put a preposition after something. You don't put a verb at the end or something. You use adverbs accordingly. There are these rules that you have to comply with. But then all that gets thrown out the window when you start making use of the fishballs. Pag nagtataglish na tayo, when we speak in like phonetic language, we know that as multilinguals, as bilinguals, all of this doesn't necessarily hold true all the time. Language is basically a means of communication that is commonly accepted within a community. You can speak Conyotic English for all I care in Ateneo, and it would be very normal because all of us understand the same contexts. But you cannot use this if you were somewhere in maybe Ilocos or in China or in the US. There has to be a match, a leveling of context between the communicator and the receiver to be able to understand how these messages pass. And this will tie into more philosophical concepts now. Because if I understand correctly, langgam in certain languages in the Philippines can actually mean bird. And bird, ibon, in some other languages here, can mean langgam or ant in other languages. So what does this tell us? Language is very arbitrary. It's totally nonsensical. In this case, on a computer science course, if I talk to you guys about bugs, you will think of it as a software error. But if I'm teaching a biology course and I talk to you guys about bugs, definitely it would be an arthropod or an arachnid or something like that. And you see, context is what really matters when communicating. And this is what's normally taken for granted when conducting language analytics or language AIs, because you start to miss out on the meaning behind these words. And this is where we get a bit philosophical with these matters. We have to define what meaning is. So David Lewis, one of the foremost researchers in linguistic theory, this tries to go about this by saying that he distinguishes between two topics. First, the description of possible languages or grammars as abstract semantic systems, where symbols are associated with aspects of the world. So dog is mapped out to the idea of a fluffy, quadrupedal being with a snout. And second, the description of the psychological and sociological facts, whereby a particular one of these abstract semantic systems is the one used by a person or population. So context. And this is where bug can be both a software error and an insect. It is essentially associated with a real world object, but is also contextually defined by a specific segment of a population. And this is where confusion comes in. This is where all the context issues come into play. language is some arbitrary system. And so we have to first define what the meaning of a symbol is for a person or a group. And then in what scenarios regarding the person or group does that symbol have a particular meaning? Ito. So this is one of my favorite siguro XKCD memes, no? Which basically plays around the idea of miscommunication. Anyway, I could care less. I didn't think you could care less. Saying you could care less implies you care at least at some amount. So there's some looseness there. If you ever have a fight with your SO, some of you guys might encounter this. I know I have. I don't know. And so we're essentially these unbelievably complicated brains drifting through the void, trying to connect with one another using some medium of communication, words, language, with one another by blindly flinging these words into the darkness. So one effort of communication to the other has some hope to it. No? I hope that you understand the context of what I'm saying, because we are entirely different entities and beings. I'm a 20-year-old person. I grew up in an entirely different context from what you guys have. But thankfully, it's similar enough for me to be able to use the same words that you use, to be able to use the same reference that you are familiar with. No? So essentially, every choice of phrasing and spelling and tone and timing carries countless signals and contexts and subtexts through time. And every listener interprets these signals in their own way. So it's essentially not really a formal system, but a form of chaos that is understood by consensus. And you can never really know what any word will mean to anyone. And this is why AI for language is so hard. You look on Twitter, you try to understand what's written there using AI, using machine learning, you will not. Because there are so many mixed contexts, mixed nuances of language. We have Becky speak, we have Jeje, we have Leet speak, we have K-pop languages, K-pop stan Twitter people talking about things in a weird way. We have the various languages, Bisaya, Hiligaynon, Waray, Tagalog, Fukien. We have the mix of Fukien and Filipino, Fukien and English. Those things all map out into essentially combinations of ideas and contexts that are so explosively complex that building systems and rules to define them using a computer would be an untenable problem. And this is where a lot of AI actually comes in to solve the problem of scale. Because you wouldn't want to have a dictionary for each of these languages when each of these languages actually change day by day. Yeah. So we have to break down what a language is into syntax, semantics, and discourse, and identify how AI and computer science comes in to represent these things. So I understand this is a bit philosophical, guys. Please bear with me, but given that we're working with communication here, language, this is as philosophical as it gets. This is probably one of the most philosophical topics in AI. And this is why, to me, AI is so beautiful. It's not just CS. It could be philo, it could be linguistics, it could be metaphysics even. We just use computers to make sense out of things. Okay, so by defining syntax, we define what grammars are. So a grammar does not define the meaning of a string, only their form. What does this mean? So essentially order. You cannot put a preposition before a noun in some contexts. No? At its most simple, a grammar defines what combination of characters is accepted by a language. So think of it in this way. If you guys are writing a function, a mathematical function, there is a grammar that you have to observe. You have to put a constant before a variable. You have to put a variable before the exponentiation. You don't put the exponentiation before the variable. You put the calculus operands necessarily in the proper positions. You follow laws of PEMDAS. You follow parentheses, bracketing. You follow how fractions are ordered. No? So there are structures that you have to follow to be able to communicate that function to whoever is reading or solving the math problem. Similarly, these are how grammars work in language. No, there are rules that we follow, albeit a bit loosely defined, so that we can converse fairly clearly and effectively. Yeah. Lemmatization and stemming is essentially the idea of extracting the root component of a word. So if I have the word telling, the root of that is to tell. That is the lemmatized or stemmed version of the word telling. Interesting is the full word. Interest is the shorthand. That is the lemmatized or stemmed version. So we try to cut the long word into its original or root or most compressed, condensed form to be able to extract information more effectively. Kasi you don't really care about tense. Not in most cases. No? I can talk to you and tell you an idea without observing proper rules of tense, proper forms of speech. I can tell you, kain, food, me. What does that mean? Generally, I either ate food or want to eat food. That tells you enough. It doesn't tell you when I wanted to eat food or when I will eat food or if I have eaten food, but it tells you enough information versus nothing. No? And that's a big thing already. And this is essentially how babies grow to form their own ideas of language. They have these very basic ideas of language, of how the words make sense to one another. And then as they grow, as they encounter more inputs into their system from the real world, they're able to further define the more nuanced components of language for greater precision of communication. Ayan. And with further lemmatization and stemming, we remove all prefixes, suffixes, modifiers for plurals and tenses, etc. Part of speech tagging is the exercise by which we identify what symbol the word is, whether it's a verb, a noun, a preposition, or an adjective. And this is where it becomes a bit mathematical in nature. We identify using some dictionary, using some corpus or body of text programmatically, what each verb looks like now. So we know that doing is an adverb, is a verb, happy is either a modifier or a verb or an adjective. And there are these permutations of words. Now we know that on is a preposition, under is also a preposition, but it could also be a noun or a verb, no, by being on, like turning a light switch on, not on top of. So there are these nuances that we have to worry about. And part of speech tagging seeks to break that down into a very programmatic structure. This was the 90s standard for understanding language. We broke down sentences into their parts of speech and built specific functions here. No, that essentially Bob made a book collector happy the other day. We break it down into its specific part of speech tags and identify what this means using these sorts of components. We know now that this, however, will not hold true for most cases because language does not have to follow a clear and arbitrary system of rules. It can be very dynamic. And so we move on to the study of morphology, the most basic foundation of information in language. And it's not necessarily a word. So a morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning in language that is not necessarily a word. Okay? So there are kinds of morphemes here, a bound and a free morpheme. I won't bother you guys with the technical aspects of it. But what morphemes try to do, what morphemes try to identify is what is the smallest unit of meaning in a word. It's kind of similar to stemming, but maybe more dynamic in nature. Stemming is more procedural. Like you remove INGs, you remove plurals, ES, you remove prefixes, those things. Morphology is more abstract in nature. Semantics. Ayan. Identification of higher ordered meaning of symbols in sentences. So this is where named entity recognition comes in. Identifying structures of what words mean within a sentence or phrase. And this is sort of the inverse of what morphology is. No? Yeah. So here is a snapshot of one of the biggest articles in Wikipedia by Sir Mr. Richard Paul Astley. And we have here certain parts of speech, no, that have been identified. Named entity recognition. We know that Richard Paul Astley is a person. We know that English here is used as a definition of location, so born in England. We know that the word song is identified as some piece of art. We know that the songwriter here maps to some profession of the person in nature, so it's tagged as a person. So what named entity recognition does is, given a sentence, given a phrase, it tries to break down the higher ordered named entities of text. And what a named entity is whether it identifies the word to be an organization, a person, a place, a noun, a number, a symbol, a profession, a cultural phenomenon, those sorts of things. And it helps inform greater decisions when building AI systems. So if you want to think about this politically, if you're scraping Twitter and trying to identify the sentiment of tweets for a specific political candidate, you can use named entity recognition to identify what persons are being talked about in this tweet. And then further break it down to identify what is the sentiment that is being said or spoken about this person. And then this is where it ties in sentiment analysis, essentially. The sentiment analysis seeks to identify higher ordered meaning of symbols and sentences mapped to emotion. So this is a sample of what sentiment analysis looks like. We have a document, a snapshot of text, could be a paragraph, could be a phrase, could be a literal document, a page, PDF of text. And we're able to identify its sentiment, either positive, neutral, or negative, usually ranging between -1, negative to +1 on the positive end. And that's a spectrum where you fall across your sentiment scores. And you're able to identify the score per line or the score per sentence, whether it's mostly positive or negative. And there are many tools out there that do this. In the NLP class that we offer in DISCs, we teach you guys how to build NLP tools, sentiment analytics tools to provide insights on how to do this for the mixed languages that we have here in the Philippines. Because this is a challenge if you're only working in English, but your market, your user base, the Filipino people, speak in multiple languages. So you need greater intelligence on how that works. Word similarity analysis is very exciting because we try to understand what multiple words a symbol could be associated with following a specific context. So going back to my example earlier, so let's move to this demo later. If I talk to you guys about the word bug in the biological context, you would probably think of words like spider, insect, fly, mosquito, beetle. And these are words that are heavily associated with that topic word, bug, in that context of biology. Switching contexts, however, if we go into the context of computer science, and I say the word bug, you guys will probably think of compiler errors, runtime errors, red code, I don't know, formatting problems, a crashed server, a crashed system, a 404, a 503, etc. And so you see that the associated words vary depending on context. And this really helps in the academic and research sense because we're able to identify and predict what the next likely words will be used. If we want to do speech to text or if we want to do autocomplete, we identify the context and then we identify what is the universe of words that this will likely fall into next rather than, using everything. It narrows the search space. Instead of using every potential word as a next prediction, we narrow it down to what its context will likely inform and allow for. And so here, we have the sentence Kobe Bryant wife Vanessa spoke. So this is a tweet, a really bad one at that, but we're able to identify that there are multiple contexts, there are multiple similar words And here we have a few named entities in place. So let's break it down. Kobe, here is a name. Kobe Bryant is interestingly associated with education, definitely with sports as a profession. And interestingly, we have politics here as well as a similar associated context. Likely this was due to the somewhat political nature of the crash a few years ago. And here we have very similar words. No? So we know that, I don't know why Irithel is here, but and Aurora, though, but the likely hypothesis here is people who tweet about Kobe also tweet about maybe Dota or some other video games. And this is why we have associated words as follows. We have Jinky here. So the concept of a sportsman's wife, maybe. So we see that there are these ideas that float around online. And so you guys are able to hopefully appreciate that this is what natural language processing tries to do. We have broken down the concepts into syntax, semantics, and eventually we want to be able to understand how discourse works. So syntax and semantics is just input, identifying what the input maps out to and what it means. Discourse means that there has to be a back and forth, there has to be a conversation. And this is where it can get challenging. Identifying how discourse works and how to best communicate with another entity from a computer, from an agent-based model, is more challenging. How do you communicate? How do you talk to somebody else? How do you convey the information that is needed? Tayo pa nga lang, well ako, hirap na nga akong kumausap ng ibang tao. What more a human, an AI or an agent-based system? No? We know in our previous lessons that given agent-based systems, you want to take your piece, right, your environment, your percepts, your actions, and utilize your environment and your inputs to move towards some economic advantage. You want to be in a better position than you were previously. How do you use discourse? How do you use language to do that? And that's a very open problem. How do you use language to convey information that better improves your position? And this is where it can get very creative because language is very complicated. There are people who are really good language users, who can essentially make people do what they want them to do just by talking to them. This can work if you're in a position of power. Utusan ka ng nanay mo, gagawin mo yan. But if you're like my friend, and I ask you, oy, pabili naman ng beer para sa inuman mamaya, you're gonna be like, what is it for me? Anong makukuha ko dyan? What economic advantage do I get out of that? And so whether these numerous, complex, interpersonal, intersocial decisions that come into play when using language as a means of working with your environment, this is where it becomes very interesting. And this is probably where AI could be further developed specifically for Southeast Asia, given the mix of languages we have. Building on the idea of the agent-based system, if you guys consider yourselves as agents and you use language to interact with the world, I hope that gives you guys an idea of how complex language actually is and how the problem of NLP is a very hard problem because we seek to define and work with concepts that are not necessarily immediately representable in a computer science perspective. Sige, yeah, this is the end of the intro slide I have for NLP. It's a very broad overview. It was somewhat philosophical, but these are the exercises, the tools, and the concepts that we work with to begin thinking about natural language processing in AI. So if you guys have any questions, please let me know. Let's have a quick session today. I understand many of you want to hold and have consultation afterwards. So we'll end it here. And if you guys have any questions, consultations, I'll hang out dun sa Discord group natin for any clarifications on that. Sige, yeah, thanks guys. Hope that was somewhat interesting to you guys. Next session will be with Dr. Ray, but I think we can provide you guys with a bit more material on NLP, maybe more tangible use cases of how we can use language to make sense out of the world. But this overview hopefully provided you guys with some perspective on how challenging and how really interesting it is as a field.